Right, morning. Welcome, everybody. So today we're talking about being unconscious, being conscious, being incompetent, being competent, being unconsciously incompetent, being consciously incompetent, being consciously competent, and being unconsciously competent. And after all of those things, I'm completely confused. So the question is, we know all the cliches. We know all the, first you make your habits, then your habits make you or break you. We know all of those sorts of things, but what does it mean in reality? It reminds me of our talk that Oscar Chalupsky gave us at the last virtual trade fair at Global. And he says, everybody normally says practice makes perfect. He says, no, that's not actually true. Practice makes permanent. So if you practice the wrong things become permanent. If you practice the right things become permanent. So you've got to be careful what you practice. Because those are the things that turn into those unconscious competencies. They could be good, they could be bad. They could be taking in the direction that you want them to take you. They could be doing completely the wrong thing. So if you've got a bad golf swing, Trevor and Jasper, if you keep on practicing it, guess what? It ain't going to get any better. You need someone to tell you how to do it properly first, and then you might start practicing the right things. So on that note, we better go across to Trevor Null first this morning.
Oh dear. I like to practice unconscious competence. So why am I told to actually be conscious of whatever competence I might have? Just as I was considering this topic, the thought came to my mind that as we go through life and we are striving for this conscious competence, I think the only revelation that makes sense to me is that when we think we know everything, the only time that we really get into be consciously competent is when we recognize that we know nothing. So how does that relate to conscious competence? Meaning that I now know that I know nothing. So from there, I have to revert back to my unconscious state. That's about the depth of my thought into this particular topic. And your reference to Oscar, look, if there's anyone that you actually want to follow for who consciously made a decision at a young age to be the best of the best, this is the guy. I know of no one else apart from perhaps Muhammad Ali, who in my younger days was an individual who talked himself into being for himself the best of the best. Oscar, I think, outshines him 3,000%. So that's about my contribution for this morning.
All right, thanks, Trevor. So the question is, are you consciously incompetent about your competencies? I'm not too sure where those alliterations are going to take us, but yeah, it's some interesting thoughts. So Jasper, well, let's first say good morning to Prima, who's joined us for the first time. So welcome, Prima. You walked into our discussion this morning, so I'll give you a chance just to sit and listen for a while before I'm going to push on your button to add your contribution in, but I'm going to do that, so be prepared. You might be consciously incompetent. Yeah.
Oh dear, I didn't know there was someone new on this panel. Can I have my session again just so I can impress Prima?
No, what is done is done. You've practiced what you've practiced, and you're now unconsciously incompetent in your offering. So we'll have to see how that takes us forward. So right, Jasper, over to you.
Morning. Yeah, it's such a probably a intellectual topic that I have very little to add. I think in introduction, you have basically summarized everything there, Ivan, with your whole well, I don't know. I got confused. It sounded like the title of a song, Unconsciously Incompetence, etc., etc. But I don't know, was it you that said it or Trevor that said it? But I was then just reminded of, and is now typically I'm using a tactic here, but it's unconsciously that I'm using this tactic, and that is that I take where my mind takes me, and my mind's take me away from the topic of unconsciously competent, and it takes me to just I think was the reference to Oscar, that practice makes permanent. And when you said that, somehow it just jumped in my mind, conversations. And before I had too much time to think about conversations, you were into it and Trevor was starting to talk. So if I have to say, what made me think of conversations then? So the same with practice. Practice is that physical activity that we do on a daily basis that then eventually becomes permanent. And like you rightly say, if you then practice imperfectness, you are permanent, making that permanent, and you will never just master that thing. Well, what about conversations? And isn't that what we are doing this morning? And how many other people are also starting their day with conversations, and they're starting their day with conversations in the car, on WhatsApp, at work, and what are those conversations? And then the other word that then jumped up, conversations determine destination. And if I can, so I'm now deviating from the topic, but it's all your fault. So I want to focus on conversations. So what kind of conversations are we having? And again, conversations is a choice. So you can't, and well, the other thing is, do we choose it, or are we unconsciously trapped in conversations that happen day after day with the same kind of people that adds nothing to my life but distract from it? But I'm so unaware or unconscious of what I'm busy doing for myself, because words has power. So I then just repeat yesterday into today, but I don't know why I'm not happy and things are not working out. So so for me, the trigger word in what you've started off is conversations. And then if we have to apply this thing, then if what is currently happening in my life is not working, okay, now I'm becoming conscious of my incompetence. Then I need to, and hopefully someone alert me to the fact that, listen, change your conversations. Now, it might be very difficult to have different conversations with the same crowd. I might have to choose a new crowd. And I think this is what's interesting with this every morning session. We have different conversations, and we often have a new crowd. So welcome, Prima. You have now changed the crowd today. But there's a new dynamic, first of all on the topic, and then getting people's input on the topic. So yes, so I've rambled on for a while, but I've unconsciously rambled on a topic that I don't understand anything of. So I hand it back to you, Ivan.
Oh, thanks, Jasper. So you've taken us down the rabbit hole. Oh dear. The warren of your mind. I'm not too sure where that could lead us. It could be quite dangerous. But yeah, it is interesting. And I agree with you. I think conversations are key. So what are the conversations you're listening to? Some of us listen to Russian TV and all sorts of strange things in the morning, and I've got to really wonder about what that does to our unconscious incompetence and how it leads us. Some of us listen to talk radio. Why you would want to listen to other people's discussions, I'm not too sure. So the question is, are you in your mind or are you out of your mind? So Verne, where are you?
I think what really struck me about unconscious competence, which is a really good place to be if you are genuinely competent at what you do, is that you develop a laziness and you actually stop listening to people. You sort of, if I think about servicing my clients, I'm competent at what I do and I know this, but I have to stop sometimes and listen to what the client actually wants. Does he want me to provide my unconscious competence? Or do I actually need to actively listen to him and become conscious of what he needs? Even if in the process I become consciously incompetent, I can then work on that. and I can actually develop into a competence, which will, and I think that, like the example that Lee gave yesterday was driving, that we drive unconsciously and we're good at it. But what if we actually stopped and looked around? What if we actually sort of paid attention to our driving? And I think it's really important. Well, I found it really important to actually just stop and say, I'm meeting a client later this morning. And I thought to myself, I've got this whole preparation of everything I'm going to give him, what I've done for him, and it's all good. But maybe I should actually just sit down and listen to what he actually wants and become conscious of what he needs. And that was the sort of thought that I had about this topic, is that perhaps unconscious competence is not the end of it. We need to go back to conscious, whether it's competent or incompetent. And that was the takeaway for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Renee. Yeah, I agree. I think a large part of it is about listening. You know, I mean, Trevor Carty also spoke about rewiring the neurons yesterday, and I think that's where this all comes down to, doesn't it? It's a process of actually listening, not only to others but to yourself at times, and saying, what am I actually saying? What am I doing it? Why am I doing it? And then making the conscious choice, as you say, to now learn something new or relearn something that you perhaps have been doing imperfectly because you've just been doing it so often. So Trevor Carty, how are your neurons this morning?
Let's just talk about that golf swing. Okay. And it doesn't matter where you go in the game of golf. No one has a perfect golf swing, but what they have is a perfect objective. And the perfect objective is par or better than par. And so it doesn't matter if you, man, we've seen some Masters champions, we got actually such bad swings. But Oscar's right. Practice makes permanent. And if the permanence of that practice gets you to a swing which can get you to par or better, and it can beat the field, well, then you are a champion. And then you will lift the silverware. And then it doesn't really matter whether you subconsciously, unconsciously, inconsciously, underconsciously, overconsciously, incompetent, undercompetent, overcompetent. It's about what you've practiced and whether that practicing gets you to be par or under par with your peers. Because at the end of the day, it's all about winners, and we all want to be winners.
Okay, Trevor, all right. Thought the golf thing might tweak you a little bit there. So yeah. So Cecile, talking about tweaking, how unconsciously competent are you when you're kicking people around the dojo?
That is a very interesting question, because the grading that I did last week made me discover that in the last 8 months, I have been practicing imperfect, kata, basics, whatever. So when I am now under the watchful eye of a 7th Dan, and it's like learning a whole new karate, because all the, let's say, habits that I had that were wrong I have to change. I'm even struggling with my feet, because my feet were like pointing to the side instead of forward. So my muscles are struggling. I'm struggling. It's like learning a whole new karate. And the objective, exactly like what Trevor Carty said, is to regrade before the end of the month. So the stuff, let's say the habits that I learned that no one corrected in the last 7 years, I have to correct in a month. Luckily, it's not new sequences, but it's a lot of new work. So sure, I am struggling to become. And so I have been doing the imperfect, let's say the practice makes imperfect, perfect stuff for months. And I'm now in the process of changing it. And it is very difficult, but I'm doing it because I have an objective in mind. So yeah, so that's where I am at the moment.
Thanks, Cecile. And I think that's key. You know, what is the reason why? So why would you want to change something? Why do you want to do something? Why do you want to do something better? So Ed, starting running at 40 and then going and running for 7 days in the desert. Why would you want to do that?
Absolutely no idea, but I do know the castle lager tastes better at the end. Yeah, I thought Lee's analogy about the driving was very useful and kind of links in with what Cecile was saying, because, you know, being unconsciously competent is a good thing sometimes, because you imagine when you first learned to drive, how much energy it took, how much thought it took. And if you wanted to drive from Johannesburg to the Kalahari, you know, you'd be a nervous wreck by the time you got to the end if you weren't unconsciously competent. If you could change gear without thinking about it, if you could do, you know, all those sort of things. So I think, you know, being unconsciously competent is a good thing. But I remember when I bought a powerful sports car, I took a defensive driving course because it brought the insurance down. And boy, did I learn that how I was become unconsciously incompetent, because I'd picked up loads of bad habits. You know, I used to drive with my hand sitting on the gear stick or whatever it was. And I went out with a police instructor, and a bit like Cecile found, I was doing loads of things wrong. And that was a wake-up call. And strangely enough, just before lockdown, the first lockdown we went into, I took a test to be allowed to drive a minibus full of children. And on the first course I went on, boy, did I learn how many problems there were with my driving, which I'd fallen into, despite the fact I'd already realized that I'd fallen into it. So I think, you know, we do become unconsciously incompetent when we think we're competent. And that, and you know, Jasper said it was an intellectual exercise. I don't think it is. It's a very practical exercise. Just think, you know, you get a new job, you find out where the best coffee shop is, you try a couple of coffee shops out, one sells dodgy coffee, one sells coffee that's okay. So you go in the coffee shop that's okay, and every single day for the next 2 years, you buy your coffee from that shop. What you don't know is the other shop that had the dodgy coffee has changed owners and now has the best coffee in the country. So you then suddenly go from being consciously competent to unconsciously incompetent. And that made me think about the quote from William H. Murray about commitment. I don't know if I've used it before. And he said, when you commit, providence moves, and all sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. And that's a load of dosh, because those things would have happened anyhow. You just spot them. And I think that's the importance about conscious competence. You spot things that will help you. And I think it was both Trevor and someone else that talked about listening and conversations, and very few of us listen. If we actively listen, we then spot the opportunities, spot the things. And so I think conscious competence and unconscious competence, you know, the kind of two sides of the same thing. And that got me thinking about Both Sides Now by Joni Mitchell. Joni Mitchell I'm a big fan of hers. I think it was due to teenage hormones more than an appreciation of music. And then that made me think about Big Yellow Taxi, which is what everyone probably associates her with. And that was 50 years ago. And what's in that song is still relevant today. And I wondered whether there are some things we're conscious of, but we just choose to ignore. So I think, you know, that's my thoughts. So yes, unconscious competence is very useful. Or, and the other thing, if you look at most of the disasters that happened on expeditions, you know, climbing Everest, going to the North Pole, you know, whatever it is, almost all of the things that go wrong and result in deaths or big problems happened really early on, when someone made a very minor decision that was the wrong decision, and loads of things flowed from that. And the reason they made that small decision was because they were acting in unconscious competence mode. They did what they always did, and they didn't detect that something very small had changed. And the decision they normally made wasn't the right decision. So I think it can be very, very dangerous to be unconsciously competent. And we should always try and step back into that, reassessing us, getting a coach to look at us, like Cecile found, like I found with my driving. So I think it's probably a good idea to have a coach or a buddy or someone to look in and say, hang on a minute, you're doing what you always did and you shouldn't be. So that's my thoughts. And yeah, I'd love to talk more about Joni Mitchell.
Still those teenage hormones, Ed, going there. All right, great. So yeah, two things came out of that for me. I mean, the Murray quote is one of my favorites, and you say it's a lot of dosh, but you know, for me, it's about people say, you know, oh, isn't he so lucky? You know, and for me, luck is where preparation meets opportunity. You know, if you haven't prepared, the opportunity will still be there, but guess what? You're not going to get lucky because you weren't prepared, and you're not consciously looking for it. So.
It's my favorite quote, and I totally believe it. It's just the providence moving isn't the thing. All sorts of things don't occur that would never otherwise have occurred. They would happen anyhow. Absolutely. It's just that you spot them. So yeah, I love that quote.
Yeah, me too. Great. Thanks. Thanks, Ed. Right, Donovan, let's get across to you.
Morning. Thank you, Ivan. Morning, everyone. Yeah, for me, it's all about habits, dealing with habits. You know, to identify the bad habits, try our best to get rid of them, and then to focus and improve on the good habits and learning new habits. Yeah, it's a good thing to have good habits, you know, things that allow you to do things without taking your energy and concentration, making, you know, the energy available to do other things better, to learn, you know, new things. So yeah, it's about keeping the good habits and learning new habits and, you know, improving yourself. And then I just have a question. Shouldn't the terminology change a bit from unconscious competence to subconscious competence? Thank you.
Thanks, Donovan. Yeah, good question. Probably the same thing, but I'm not sure. It could be an interesting point to pick up. All right, so Prima, you're up next. What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far? What are your thoughts on what you've gotten yourself into this morning? And yeah, love to hear from you. From Mauritius, by the way, folks. So you know, some of us are lucky, so sort of sitting on the beach in Mauritius, and you know, well. You just need to unmute yourself, Prima. You're muted.
Sorry, it's about adapting yourself to the different environments. Just like right now during the COVID, you have to be like consciously what's happening and consciously what you have to do to adapt yourself to the changing condition, and not to like lying stuck in when suddenly something happens. It's about how to open yourself to the global environment. That's it. Thank you.
Right. Good. Thanks. Well, thanks, Prima. Yeah, and thanks for joining us this morning. I hope you can on a more regular basis as well. You just have to make us really jealous and show us some shots of the sea sometimes. Right. So, Steve, dig into the minds of the people that have spoken and tell us whether they're conscious, unconscious, competent, or incompetent.
Yeah, just we're delving into the mindset of the psychoanalytic, at least in my mind. You know, what Cecile shared made me think about, I'll paraphrase a quote from Bruce Lee, and he's talking about unconscious competence. And he says, your hand needs to know what to do with the other's fist before your brain does. And if you're going to be any good at any kind of martial art, you have to be able to reach that point of unconscious action, because otherwise you're just going to get the snot kicked out of you every time you step into a fighting ring. And I think
I'm quite a fan of something called spiral dynamics, which means it's a developmental framework, which means we build ourselves upwards, or we develop upwards in a spiral, which means we don't replace that part of ourselves which has gone before, but we're basically building forwards in this spiral. And I think part of the idea of unconscious competence is to unpack things. You've got to spend time in reflective thinking and asking yourself the question, why am I doing this, if you want to develop, so that you can look at what you've been doing. Well, let me put it this way. I think unconscious competence and rote habits are not necessarily the same thing. And so if you want to make sure that you're not just operating out of rote habit, and I like that Oscar quote, that the practice makes permanent. If you want to unpack that, then you have to be reflectively thinking on what you're doing the whole time and asking why. But it doesn't mean that having unconscious competence is a bad thing, because it can be a very, very good thing. As Ed said, I think in terms of driving, I would find it highly frustrating to always have to think about what I'm doing with both feet and my hands while I'm driving. But I can reach a new level in the spiral of my development where I realize what has gone before no longer serves me as deeply as it should or it could. And I think it's the same thing with our personalities and with our intellectual development, etc. And so I would just borrow some of the Freudian thinking and say that part of our life is to delve deeper and deeper into our sub and our unconscious, which are two different things, to know ourselves better. And so to be able to bring that more and more to bear in the world. And that's part of reflecting on your unconscious competence, or at least then your unconscious habits, which can be different things. And so that the better you're able to dig into that and reflect on that, the better able you are to become more and more yourself and bring that to bear in the world. Yeah, I've got so many other thoughts, but I'm just going to ramble. So I think we'll leave it at that.
Okay, Steve, thanks. Well, I'm sure Donovan will be keen for you to unpack the difference between sub and unconscious minds at some point in time, because that was the question that he asked while he was driving. I mean, why you would be driving and talking on your phone? I'm not too sure, Donovan, but that seemed that all of us were talking about driving in one form or another.
Here's your first example. Driving on your phone is in the subconscious, not the unconscious.
No.
Yeah, there you go. So he's consciously turning now and got his indicators going unconsciously and watching his phone subconsciously. So I'm not too sure which of those in what order, but to go back to something that Trivanel said in the beginning, I think one of the challenges, and I must pick up on what Steve has said as well, I'm not sure that necessarily the spiral is completely true, because there are definitely things that you have to trash and replace from time to time. So where does that take you in the spiral? Are you building on something, or are you actually replacing something at times? I'm not sure, but yeah, I think what Trevor said earlier for me is, the more I learn, the less I know, and the worse I speak. So get your tongue tied around these things sometimes, but but I think that's definitely the case. I think a lot of people, when they unconsciously incompetent, they don't realize how much they don't know. And to become consciously incompetent, you start realizing just how much you don't know, which then gives you the opportunity for growth and for improvement. So that's my sixpence worth on it. So Trevor's wagging his finger at me unconsciously, but I know he likes doing that from time to time. So I'm going to hand it back to him, because not only does he need to say what he wants to say, he needs to wrap it up this morning and tell us what we're going to talk about tomorrow.
I haven't got a clue what we're going to talk about tomorrow, but I just wanted to say, within a sporting environment and a highly competitive environment, my thinking as I've been listening to people here, is that you're actually playing at an extremely unconscious level, that you've done all of your training, you flat out, and if you're in a team sport, you've worked with individuals, you know them instinctively, and you know how they react, and it's almost as if you do things absolutely unconsciously, but it's because you've been practicing with individuals all the time. And this thing of conscious competence almost gets me to the point where people are overthinking things. So I made the comment there in the chat forum that perhaps unconscious competence takes you into the top 1%. that most people are unconsciously incompetent or consciously incompetent, which I think is what Michael Jackson actually turned around and said. But those that actually strive for the top 1% actually tend to become unconsciously competent. And then there might be the individuals who become the winners who are consciously competent. But as I thought about that, I don't think that's the case. I think if you're at the top, going for the winner's podium, it's all inside of you, and it's something that's deep down. It's very hard to think your way through to the top. But I'm arguing against myself here all the time. So I love having this debate with myself. The rest of you can go. I'm staying online with myself till 9 o'clock and try and work this thing out.
Yeah, well, you know what Oscar Wilde said one time when the hostess at a party said to him, "Mr. Wilde, are you enjoying yourself?" And he said, "Yes, thank you, madam. There's no one else here to enjoy." So that sounds a bit like Trevor. So arguing with himself. So Trevor, carry on arguing with yourself. Tell us what we're going to argue about tomorrow.
Well, is Lee not coming back?
She might be, but it's not fair to dump a topic on her when she comes back in the morning. But
you know what I think would be a fantastic discussion is if Edward came back with that poem. It was Neville somebody or other. It seemed like it was a cynical expose of all the bad things in life. Edward, what was that poem? What if by somebody?
Zachariah.
And if we went through a couple of those things, because I remember you making a comment, or someone made a comment that, man, I agree with all of it. And I happened to be, while I was working online, I had our Zondo commission on, and my goodness, I can now understand why billions go down the drain almost on a minute-by-minute basis in the SAA. So that's probably not short of the exaggeration that I'm giving it. But if anyone watched that yesterday, talking about competence versus incompetence and what was conscious and what was unconscious, it leads to this element of trust in our governments and trust in what's on the go. So I think some of those lines in that poem that you brought up, Edward, were about being cynical about people in charge and what's happening and how we actually work with that. And I thought it was a great poem that we shouldn't let go without us making some analysis. What do you think?
I'll send it to Lee's email, and then it can be circulated for discussion tomorrow.
Okay, I think send it to Ivan.
Okay, yeah. I'll send it to Ivan.
Send it to me, yeah. No, that'd be great. Good. Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Ed. Right, and yeah, the conversations you listen to, Trevor, Zondo Commission, I don't know, really, not sure what that's doing to you.
No. Listen, I'm worried. I'm worried about you. We're turning around to everyone and say, you know what? Get yourself out there. Get all that information in. And the moment that I actually gave a label to some of the TV stations that I listened to, you shut your mind down straight away and you branded me a red under the bed. I could hear the subliminal already. So no, now I'm going further than that. I'm listening to Turkish, what is it called? TV and all that, but I can't understand what they're saying.
Okay, Mr. Wilde, I think I'm going to cut you off there for the morning. All right, folks, have a fantastic day further, and we're poeming again tomorrow. We'll see what that engenders. I'll try and get it out as soon as possible this morning to the list. So look for that coming up and practice then. But otherwise, have a fantastic day further, and we'll see you in the morning. Go well. Cheers now.